At the beginning of the story, we see the most beautiful boy in the world. His name is Henry. Henry is very fond of writing. He wants to become the editor-in-chief of his school's newspaper. The next day at school, Henry is called for an interview with the editor. When Henry is waiting for his turn outside the room, then there we see the cutest girl in the world. Her name is Grace. As soon as these two notice each other, they are called into the room. The writing skills of both of them are highly appreciated. It is said to both of them that you both can become a very good team, a good editor-in-chief pair. But Grace refuses to work with Henry. She says she doesn't want to be an editor. After this, Grace comes out of the room, runs away from Henry, and goes after him. Henry asks him, "Why did you refuse to work with me?" Grace says, "I will do whatever I feel like. You keep your knowledge to yourself." During this argument, Henry misses the bus, due to which Henry starts walking towards his home. In such a situation, Grace tells Henry that, "My house is nearby. If you want, I can drop you." Grace gifts a book to Henry. Grace says, "This book is very beautiful. You should definitely read it." After this, Grace comes to her home with Henry. Grace says, "I don't like driving. If you have a driving license, you can take the car." Then Henry drives home with Grace. Grace says, "Your house is quite big, which means you are quite rich. Then why don't you have a car?" Henry says that, "I am very incompetent in studies. I do not get good marks. That is why my parents do not get me a car." Henry's parents had also heard this. Henry's sister tells Mom and Dad that Henry came today with a beautiful girl. Henry says that she is just my good friend. Henry's dad asks, "You had an interview today. What happened about it?" Henry says, "My interview went well. I became the chief editor." After this, Henry comes to his room and starts searching for Grace on Facebook. Henry gets Grace's account, but it was a private account. After this, Henry searches her on Google, where he finds very beautiful pictures of Grace. Grace was looking very beautiful in these pictures. Henry starts looking at these pictures. After this, Henry starts reading the book, which Grace had gifted him. Love was written very deeply in this book. The next day, the professor was discussing the newspaper. He was talking about ideas regarding some issues. After this, when Henry talks about the topics, Grace refuses to do so. She says, "I will not be able to do this. Whatever ideas you bring, I will edit them like an assistant editor." After this, one of Henry's friends tells him that, "I have fallen in love with a boy. Whenever I see him, I feel dizzy. Guitar starts playing around me. The honeymoon bed is ready in front of me." Then Henry sees Grace. So Henry leaves his friends and comes to Grace. Henry says, "I have completely read the book you gave me. It has written very beautifully about love." While Henry is talking to Grace, his friends call him on the bus. But Henry ignores them, and he goes home with Grace. After this, Henry misses Grace a lot at night. Then the next day, after returning from school, Henry asks Grace, "Can I come to your house?" Grace says, "You can't come now, come later." Then Grace says that, "We will meet here in the evening. You bring bread here." Then in the evening, they go to a dark forest where a factory was built. There used to be a cotton mill here, which is now closed. Grace goes inside that building with Henry. There was a small pond there, in which there were some fishes. Then they feed bread to those fish. After this, Grace takes Henry underwater. Grace asks Henry, "Do you have a girlfriend?" Henry says no. After this, Grace tells him the story of her accident. She says, "I had a terrible accident with a car." Grace looks at the stars and says that people are born only to get separated. The next day, Henry and other students were having a meeting on newspaper themes. The professor also asks Grace for any idea. Grace says, "I have no idea." After this, Grace gets up and leaves from there. After this, Henry's friend tells him that if you really want to know about Grace, then start stalking her. In such a situation, Henry listens to his friend and starts chasing Grace. We see Grace, who was in a very bad mood today. She was sitting near a grave on which Dominic's name was written. After Grace leaves, Henry searches the boy's name on Google. Henry comes to know about that terrible accident. Dominic was very good at sports, but he died in an accident, while his partner suffered a minor injury. When Henry looks at her Instagram account, he discovers that Grace was actually Dominic's girlfriend. The next day, Henry asks Grace to edit his article, but Grace says that whatever you have written must be good. Actually, Grace did not have to do that work at all. At night, Henry gets a message from his friend, in which he says that Grace is doing something strange. In such a situation, Henry quickly reaches Grace. Grace's leg was broken. Despite this, she was trying to run, but she falls down and starts crying. After this, Henry comes home and tries to sleep, but is unable to sleep. Then he messages Grace and asks, "Are you okay? You were in a very bad mood yesterday." Grace says, "I want to meet you tomorrow in the library. I have some ideas for the newspaper." The next day in the library, Grace gives Henry some novels written on love, people who commit suicide and love. This book focuses on this subject. Henry asks her, "Do you keep thinking about these all night?" Grace says that being young feels like a prison to me. "I feel as if I should leave all this and run away somewhere." Whenever teenagers express their feelings, they are suppressed. "I want a newspaper article to be made on this theme." After this, they start working on this idea. Henry says that if anyone has experienced such a thing, then we should tell about it. Grace then asks Henry himself. Henry says, "I had a friend named Mike. He had committed suicide. I had one of her adult magazines, but after she died, I started feeling like that magazine was haunted, so I buried that magazine near Mike's grave." After this, while coming home, Henry asks Grace, "Why did you stop writing?" Grace says that a very important person in my life had died. "I used to write very well, so I was asked to write about that person, but I could not write. That's why I've given up writing now. I will never be able to write again." After this, both of them spend a good time. Henry says, "It's my friend's birthday. Will you come with me?" Grace says, "Yes, I will come." After this, Henry brings Grace to his home. He introduces Grace to his family. After this, Henry brings Grace to his room. Henry plays the song that keeps playing in Grace's car. Grace says, "Why did you play this song?" Henry says, "Maybe you like this song. That's why it keeps playing in your car." Hearing this, Grace gets angry and leaves from there. Grace says that this song belongs only to me and Dominic. In such a situation, Henry starts apologizing to Grace. Then suddenly Grace kisses Henry and then starts going home. Henry tries to accompany Grace to the house, but Grace gets angry at him. The next day, Henry is very sad. He didn't even want to go to his friend's birthday party. Grace's friends say that your mood will freshen up at the party. You should go. After repeated insistence by his friends, Henry goes to the party. Henry sees Grace at the party, and he goes to Grace. Then both of them dance with each other, and then make love. The next day, Henry tries to call Grace, but Grace does not answer the call, so Henry leaves her a voicemail. Henry can't sleep all night. At night, Henry gets a message from Grace. She says that after a long time, someone has sent me a voicemail. The next day, Grace takes Henry to Dominic's grave. Grace says that Dominic and I always used to come to this place, but now I want to move ahead in my life. Then she kisses Henry. In this way, the relationship between these two starts. One day, Henry goes to Grace's house. Henry sees a fight going on at Grace's house. Then a woman comes out of the house and leaves angrily. After this, Henry asks Grace, "Why was your mom fighting? What problem does your family have with you?" Hearing this, Grace says, "There is no need for you to get involved in these things." Hearing this, Henry angrily gets out of Grace's car and leaves. The next day, Grace does not go to school. Henry learns from his friend that today is the anniversary of Grace's accident. Everyone at school was lighting candles for Grace's late boyfriend. After this, Henry runs to Grace's house to meet her. Here we learn that the couple we saw fighting is not actually Grace's parents, they are Dominic's parents. Henry says, "I haven't talked to Grace all day today, so I've come to meet her." Henry then goes upstairs to meet Grace. Grace says, "This is Dominic's room. I come here to get rid of my mom. My mom has started drinking too much these days." After this, Grace and Henry fight. Because Grace is still not cutting Dominic out of her life, she keeps talking about him all the time. In such a situation, Henry becomes very angry. After this, when Henry comes home, he gets angry at his family also. Then Henry's sister comes to him. She explains to him that this love entanglement that you are in is nothing. These chemicals have been released in your brain after seeing different genders. You have to come out of all this. Needed the next day when Henry was at school, Henry gets a message from Dominic's dad. He says that Grace has been missing the whole day. She is not even picking up the phone. Upon knowing this, Henry immediately runs to Grace. Grace was crying loudly here. Grace tells Henry that it was all my fault. The day our accident happened, I was having fun with Dominic. He had also forbidden me, but I did not agree, due to which we had an accident and I lost Dominic. Knowing this, Henry supports Grace. Then Grace washes away all Dominic's memories. The next day at school, The professor tells Henry that Grace has taken a year off from school to resolve some of her personal problems. She will continue her studies after a year. Now time was passing fast, but Henry still loved Grace. But Henry had learned to move on. When Henry saw Grace, he would change his path. Henry was now doing very good work on his newspaper. One day after school, Grace meets Henry and tells him that she is continuing her therapy. After this, both go their separate ways. Henry was now happy with his friends. Although both Henry and Grace love each other, but some circumstances are not good at the moment, maybe they will meet each other sometime in the future.